righty. So I do want to get to all of the issues in domestic politics. A shocking new poll that shows Republicans now up in the generic ballot, like actually up in the generic ballot, that's making a lot of headlines. Elizabeth Warren obviously making headlines. But I want to start today with a story that people are overlooking, and that is we may have like a full-scale war in the Middle East, another one in the very near future. See, when we decided that we were going to get rid of ISIS, that was a very good thing, but there's been nothing to fill the gap. And so what you're ending up with now is essentially 6 separate countries who are now involving themselves in a Syrian war. So you've got Iran that's involved in Syria. You've got Israel that's in response involved in Syria. You've got the Syrian government involved in Syria. You've got Russia involved in Syria. You've got Turkey involved in Syria. So it's a lot of countries involved in a very small space, all of them fighting for a certain level of supremacy. Of course, the United States is involved there as well. And all of this internecine warfare, it could have serious external effects. So if you missed it, over the last week, there was a major issue in which an Israeli plane was shot down. We talked about this. An Israeli plane was shot down after Israel shot down a drone from Syria. It was an Iranian-made drone, and Israel shot that down. Israel flew an F-16 over Syrian airspace. That was shot down by a Syrian anti-aircraft missile. And then Israel said, hey, you're going to shoot down our planes? Here's what we're going to do to you. And they legitimately proceeded to destroy half of the Syrian Air Force while it was on the ground. Because don't screw with the Israeli military, I think is the main message there. They went in an air raid, and they destroyed half the Syrian Air Force on the ground. One of the things this makes clear, by the way, is just how much of a lie it was. When Barack Obama said there was nothing we could do in Syria to stop, for example, the gassing of citizens of that country, Israel, in legitimately an hour, destroyed half the Syrian Air Force, half of it. Okay, if the United States had wanted to, under President Obama, after the original Bashar Assad chemical attack, we could have grounded his entire Air Force nearly immediately. But that's not the extent of the conflict. At that point, the Syrians basically backed off of Israel and said, okay, we're not interested in doing this right now. But that's really a proxy war, Syria, between Israel and Iran, because Iran is funneling supplies to Hezbollah, a terrorist group in Lebanon, through Syria, and they're moving all of those supplies directly through areas that Israel has been hitting. Meanwhile, there's the Syrian proxy war heating up between the United States and Russia. So on Tuesday, Bloomberg News reported that U.S. and Kurdish forces in Syria had killed 200 fighters, including a bunch of Russians. So Russia has a bunch of contract mercenary soldiers on the ground over there, and the Russians were fighting on the side of the embattled leader, Bashar al-Assad. They attacked a military base in the Deir ez-Zor region of Syria on February 7th. Now, there is no congressional authorization for American forces to be in Syria. Okay, this is why we actually need, as Rand Paul says, we need congressional authorization. If we're going to be there, then we ought to have Congress authorize it. The American people ought to be clear about what exactly our goals are there. Is it to solidify? Is it to preserve the status quo? Why exactly we're there? Why are men and women in harm's way? Why are we spending our cash there? The Russians, however, actually attacked a U.S.-run base, essentially. There's a U.S. force stationed with Syrian Democratic Force troops on a base, and those troops responded with artillery fire and airstrikes, and 200 to 300 Russians were apparently killed in that assault. Many of them were taken back to Moscow and treated. Now, the Russians are denying that Russian forces were involved in the attack, which at least is, for the moment, is a good thing, right? That's a good thing, because if the Russians were interested in some sort of open conflict in Syria, they would be claiming that America had attacked Russian soldiers, but they want to pretend they're not there in the first place, so this remains sort of a covert fight. However, Major Adrian Rankin-Galloway is a spokesperson for the U.S. Department of Defense. He said officials believed roughly 100 people were killed in the raid, though he said he couldn't speculate about their nationality. Bloomberg reported the number dead was closer to 200. The New York Times said dozens of Russians were believed to be killed. CIA Director Mike Pompeo, this is according to Vox.com, also refused to confirm specifics when asked whether the U.S. was responsible for killing Russian contract soldiers in Syria during a hearing on Tuesday. He said, we have seen in multiple instances foreign forces using mercenaries in battles that will begin to approach the United States. So, again, in the last week, we've seen Israel take out half of the Syrian Air Force, and we've seen the United States kill something like 100 Russian fighters, apparently. So all of this is heating up in rather rapid fashion. And meanwhile, on the domestic political scene in Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu may be in some trouble. The prime minister of Israel has now been indicted on a couple of counts of bribery. One of those counts essentially suggests that he was accepting gifts from wealthy benefactors in return for advancing their interests. There's another case that suggests that he was trying to strike a deal that would have given him positive coverage in Yediot Aharonot, which is one of the major newspapers in Israel, in exchange for hurting Israel Hayom, which is the free rival to Yediot Aharonot. That one I find a little more suspicious, since the fact is that Israel Hayom is very pro-Netanyahu in the first place, and it is funded by Sheldon Adelson, who's an ally of Bibi's politically. According to the police, in Case 1000, Netanyahu received champagne, cigars, jewelry, and clothing by demand and systematically valued at about 1 million shekels, which is about 280 grand in American dollars. The gifts he received from the Israeli-American Hollywood producer Arnon Milchan increased significantly once Netanyahu was elected prime minister. So there is a case to be made against him in the media case. One of the problems in that case is that one of the people testifying against him is a political rival who is a former news guy, Yair Lapid. He is now in the opposition. He was Netanyahu's finance minister in the past, and he has been testifying against Netanyahu. Bottom line is that in order for Netanyahu to step down, he's probably going to have to be convicted. Unclear whether he actually would be convicted in these cases. And right now, with Israel under fire, it's pretty unlikely that Netanyahu is going to step down in the middle of all this. So what we're seeing right now, in other words, is chaos across the region. And the Saudis, the Jordanians, the Egyptians, the Israelis are all working hand in hand in order to try and stop the impact of Iranian influence in the region. Meanwhile, Turkey is trying to flex its muscles in places like Syria as well as Kurdistan. It is shocking how the West has abdicated its responsibility. And part of that, a huge percentage of that, most of that, is on the Obama administration, which went out of its way to embolden Iran, which went out of its way not to do anything with Bashar Assad, which went out of its way to let ISIS run roughshod throughout the Middle East, at least until its latter days. The Trump administration has said a lot of the right things on the Middle East, but they're not actually doing a lot on the Middle East. So whenever there's an uprising in Iran, for example, we say a lot of stuff, but it's not clear that we're actually doing much of anything. In Syria right now, we're doing a few things, but not enough that we're actually seriously involved, and too much to say that we're not involved at all. At a certain point, we're going to have to take a harder position on what exactly we want to see happen in Syria, because otherwise the chances of escalation here are increasingly likely. It's increasingly likely that this will end up spiraling out of control. Israel will hit the Syrians will hit Israel, Iran will be drawn in, Israel will go to war with Iran. A regional war like that would look a lot like World War III, because Russia then might be drawn in on one side with the United States on the other. All of that would be due to the abomination of foreign policy that was the Obama administration. But if the United States doesn't take some pretty clear, active measures right now, then this thing could escalate out of control pretty quickly, and we would be dragged into a situation that we really do not want to be involved in the first place. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about domestic politics in just a second. But first,
all right, Ben, you have not shied away at times from being very critical of President Donald Trump. Let me ask you specifically, what do you think about his Middle East policy so far?
I mean, I think his Middle East policy has been quite good. I think that President Trump has responded quite correctly to the stupidity of the Obama policy that made Iran a regional player by strengthening the alliance between Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Egypt, and Israel, and his move to make Jerusalem the official capital of Israel, according to the United States, is one that will actually strengthen that alliance, not weaken it, because it actually takes the issue off the table for discussion. So I think that so far his Middle Eastern policy has been a hell of a lot better than I thought it would be when he was elected.
Ben, that being said, do you believe, though, it was a wise decision for Trump to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital at this time, even for him to say that the issue of Jerusalem was, quote, off the table for future negotiations? It did lead to violence here, as you know, in the Middle East, and there does seem to be that there's no clear policy moving forward.
I mean, there was no clear policy before, so I'm not really shocked that there is there's no clear policy now. I mean, the fact is you cannot negotiate with people who want to murder you, and the Palestinian Authority has been offered pieces of Jerusalem at least 2 times in the last 15 years. They've walked away from the table both times. So all of that was merely a ruse so that they could launch violence and complain about Israeli intransigence and all the rest of it. The fact is that Israel is not giving up the old city of Jerusalem. When Ehud Olmert offered to internationalize the old city of Jerusalem, Mahmoud Abbas didn't even come up with a counteroffer. So I'm not sure exactly what anyone expects from Israel at this point, and I'm glad that Trump doesn't expect anything from Israel on this point either, because it would be stupid to do so.
So what do you make of the State Department's decision, though, to not say Jerusalem, Israel on official documents and maps, that there's no change in the passport policy at all?
Yeah, that's absurd. I have a niece who was born in Jerusalem, and her passport is just Jerusalem, not Jerusalem, Israel. That's ridiculous and insane. And I would hope that the Trump administration would do something about that and just order it. I mean, the State Department is part of the Trump administration. I would hope that they would order the State Department to simply start issuing those passports.
Ben, in some past articles and comments, you've been vocal about supporting population transfers. You once wrote in Town Hall, quote, if Israel is to exist, you must allow Israel to transfer the Palestinians and also Israeli Arabs from Judea, Samaria, Gaza, and even Israel proper. You're talking about the entire West Bank. Do you still believe that? And do you think it's a practical solution?
No, I wrote that column actually back when I was 19 years old, so that's not my current position on the issue. I've actually denounced my own position on the issue from back when I was 19. What I've suggested in my solution is that there is no long-term solution other than security, and that security is going to be reached simply by Israel annexing territory that it feels that it needs to maintain for its own security, and then protecting that area with its military. There is no long-term peace solution here because, again, Israel is facing down an implacable foe, and deporting millions of people from Judea and Samaria is not a practical solution or a moral one either.
Ben, Israel's current defense minister, very vocal about his support for land swaps. Many politicians, in fact, do advocate publicly for land swaps. What are your thoughts on land swaps? Do you think it's a good idea moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, land swaps are a different thing, right? There you're talking about Israel giving up certain lands in less populated areas in favor of areas that Israel has already cultivated and settled, right? Talking about making sure that Efrat remains part of Israel, obviously, and then giving up some land in another part of Israel to make up for that. I don't see what's implausible about that particularly, but I think that the entire process right now is implausible. The idea of giving up 1 inch of land to a terrorist regime, which is what the Palestinian Authority is, seems patently insane to me.
Ben, what would you tell President Trump right now, if he's watching right now? I mean, he said Jerusalem is Israel's capital. He said that he started the process of moving the embassy. But what specifically would you tell him he needs to do right now?
Well, I mean, I would move the embassy. I mean, not just say I'm going to move the embassy. I mean, like, actually rent a room and move the embassy there. It's not as though you need a huge space in order to make this happen. They should physically move it, because I fear that what will happen is Trump loses in 2020 and Democrats simply renege on the promise and don't move the embassy, and that leads toward more pressure for Israel to make concessions to the Palestinians. I think that you have to materially make the change. Otherwise, there's always the possibility of reversal on that. As far as other moves in the region, I think that President Trump, again, providing more material support to Iranian protesters would be a solid move. I think, and I hope, that there's coordination between the Saudis and the Israelis and the Jordanians and the Egyptians about whatever military option needs to be taken with regard to stopping the Iranian nuclear program from moving forward.
Ben, as we talk, the Israeli government, they're working on a bill that could make it a lot easier for the death penalty to be enacted on convicted terrorists. There has been vocal opposition, even from within Israel's intelligence community, about how this legislation would impact the impact of it. What do you say about the death penalty bill here in Israel?
I think the death penalty bill should absolutely pass, and I think that they should apply the death penalty as frequently as possible against murderous terrorists who leave the blood of children outside Sparrow's restaurants. The idea that Israel allows these people to languish in prison just so that the Palestinian terrorists that Hamas can take prisoners, can go capture an Israeli soldier and then try and swap them out for a terrorist, it's bad policy. It's foolish.
Ben, before you mentioned Iran, I want to go back to that point. Do you think the president is doing enough? I mean, he tweeted support for the protesters. He didn't scrap the nuclear deal. Do you think he needs to do more on the ground beyond words at this time?
Well, he should certainly scrap the nuclear deal entirely. He sort of split the baby. He decertified the deal, but he didn't scrap the entire deal as it stands. He should just get rid of the deal entirely. The Congress should move to place new sanctions on the government of Iran. And then whatever covert aid they can afford to give to the people of Iran, they should absolutely give to the protesters in order to, with the full intent of toppling that regime. That regime needs to go.
Ben, in your view, why didn't more American Jews vote for Trump in 2016? And do you think that will change in 2020? Do you think that Trump's Jerusalem speech and other speeches are cultivating more support from American Jewish voters?
Well, I mean, it depends on why people vote. I don't think that a lot of American Jews vote based specifically on Israel. I think most American Jews are irreligious and don't care particularly much about Israel, or at least they care less about Israel than they do about abortion or same-sex marriage, for example. So, laying it all at the feet of Trump's Israel policy, I think, would be foolhardy. Also, Trump happens to be a particularly toxic persona, and his associations until late with people like Steve Bannon, who was friendly toward the alt-right, had driven a lot of Jews away from Trump. I think that disassociation will help Trump. I think that Trump's particular toxicity does not play well in sort of the white-collar Jewish communities and places in major cities around the country. That said, I think that its Israel policy is obviously going to be a draw for the Orthodox Jewish proportion of the United States. I think the Orthodox Jews would vote very heavily for President Trump, as indeed they did in the last election cycle, but I think they would vote in even bigger numbers now that Trump has made clear his positions on Israel, which were really not all that clear before the election.